Washington Journal continues.
We are now going to have a discussion here for the next hour about separating boys and girls in the public education system. Abigail James is with the National Association for Single-Sex Public.
Washington Journal continues.
We are now going to have a discussion here for the next hour about separating boys and girls in the public education system. Abigail James is with the National Association for Single-Sex Public Education. And Fatima Goss-Graves is Senior Counsel with the National Women's Law Center. Good morning to both of you, and thank you for being here. Ms. James, let's start with the argument for separating boys and girls.
Well, first of all, let me make it very clear that the National Association for Single-Sex Public Education, and please let me call it NASPE just because it's too long otherwise, is very much for choice. That we do believe that parents and children ought to have the choice to have single-sex schools or not, if they choose. The reason for this is that there's a great deal and growing amount of evidence that points out that boys and girls simply do not learn in similar fashions. And the problem is, it's not that teachers can't do a good job with that, it's that they affect each other. And what happens is you have little girls who back off because the boys are going to take over, and you have boys who get involved in things which have nothing to do with education simply because they want to, they really can't compete with the girls educationally, so they try competing in other ways.
Well, what is the evidence? You said that there's growing evidence.
All right, well, you start with day-old babies. The brains for little boys and little girls don't develop in the same way. The left side of the brain develops first in girls, which is the reason that 20-month-old girls have twice the vocabulary of 20-month-old boys. And in boys, the right side of the brain develops first, which is why a 20-month-old boy can throw a ball more accurately than a 20-month-old girl. The problem is we don't look at ball throwing as a sign of intelligence. And it's certainly his inability to be articulate when he hits nursery school may make people feel like he's really just not quite there yet, and he's maybe not interested in it. We have other information that a lot of it coming from the National Institutes of Mental Health, from Jay Geed's work, and also from Deborah Yergelin Todd's work down in Florida with people who are doing different kinds of imaging to show that brains really aren't the same. Now, by the time we get to be adults, they really are. So why am I for single-sex education? Because if you put them together, then they limit themselves. If you separate children, then they get the chance to expand.
All right, well, Ms. Goss-Graves, explain to us why this is not a good idea.
Well, maybe I should take a step back and provide a little bit of the legal framework that covers it. Title IX and the Constitution do allow for single-sex schools in appropriate contexts, and there have been single-sex schools that have operated in these appropriate contexts for many, many years. So, there's sort of the common sense context, whether that might be human sexuality classes or choruses where there's vocal range differences, or, in physical education, where you have contact sports. So those are some of the common sense reasons. But in addition to some common sense reasons, the Supreme Court has said that single-sex schools are appropriate for what you might call compensatory purposes, to sort of overcome historical stereotypes and to dissipate those stereotypes. In 2006, the Department of Education released regulations that changed the landscape a bit and really invited schools to try to experiment with single-sex programs for almost any reason. And that there is where there's a problem, because there are already boundaries and guidelines about when and how it should be done. And so what you have now all over the country are, educators who And, you know, I think many are feeling a little desperate and trying to do things like reduce dropout rates, trying to do things like...
Dropout rates, is that what you said? Yeah.
Yeah, and trying to do things like address low test scores, I mean, this, among boys and girls, you know, really feeling a need, and suddenly they think, I found a magic bullet in single-sex education. So I think that little background is probably necessary, but to address Dr. James' point more directly, neuroscientists have said that there are some, you know, differences in brains for boys and girls, and in fact, if you look at 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds, they're, you know, at different stages in terms of their verbal skills and at different stages in terms of their motor skills. But what we don't have is a ton of neuroscientists coming out and saying, and those differences mean that we should educate our girls and boys differently. In fact, many have said the opposite. They've said that, you know, gender is just really too crude of a tool to use. But beyond that, there's a lot of variance among boys and a lot of variance among girls in terms of where they are, whether that be at age 4, age 10, you know, age 16. And that variance among girls and among boys is just as significant as the variance between girls and between boys.
So you're saying that some girls have the same characteristics as boys do, and some girls don't. Okay, well, we want to get our callers involved in this discussion. We're going to do the phone lines a little bit different this morning. Students, parents, teachers, if you're a student, dial 202-737-0001. If you're a parent, 202-737-0002. And teachers, 202-628-0205. Our guest will be with us here until about 8:15, 8:30 a.m. this morning, Eastern Time. Ms. James, let me get your response to Ms. Gosgrave's argument there.
Absolutely, and that's why we are for choice. For example, I'm 5'10". That's the average height of a man in this country. That doesn't make me a man. It just means I'm a very tall woman. And in point of fact, the reason that I'm such a successful teacher with boys is that I actually think much more like a boy does. And my learning is much better when I use some of the techniques that work with most boys. But they don't work with all boys. The overwhelming majority of kids do very well in a co-ed school. What we're trying to address is children for whom co-ed education is not working.
Well, who are those children?
Primarily, they are early developing girls and late developing boys. And research has been around since the 80s that points out that that single-sex schools are better for them.
Well, does that mean that within a public education system you could have a co-ed classroom and then you could pull out girls who are not going to be tall or boys who are going to be short and put them into single-sex educated classes?
Except that height isn't probably a very good, good indicator of that. But yeah. And there are a wide variety of co-ed options, everything from single-sex classes in a co-ed school to dual academies to totally separate schools. And I'm not suggesting that we do what they do in New Zealand, which is that every single city and town has 3 high schools. They have a co-ed high school, a girls' high school, and a boys' high school, and the parents choose which way their children go. Works well for them, but what I'm saying is that where parents and teachers see the need, why not try it? It certainly is another tool that we have in helping to educate children.